Welcome to Lecture 9, Part 1 of Animal Cognition. In this part, we're going to be discussing long-term memory. So we've already talked about working memory or short-term memory. Now we're going to talk about long-term memory, which is also called reference memory. And I'm going to begin by distinguishing between two kinds of long-term memories. That's declarative and non-declarative memory. But the focus of the lecture, this part and the next, is going to be on declarative memory. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about semantic memory, which is basically memories for facts. And in the second part of this lecture, we're going to be discussing episodic memory, memory for personally experienced events, another kind of declarative memory. So memory, as you know, refers to some kind of behavior change that happens as a result of some previous experience. So an animal has a certain experience in a certain situation, and this alters the animal's behavior to similar circumstances in the future. So the animal might learn something in one situation and then apply it in a relevantly similar future situation. And unlike working memory or short-term memory, long-term memory holds information for long periods of time, even when it isn't consciously being processed. So for example, it stores acquired associations, like phobias and things like that, and representations of facts and experienced events. And these can be held for long periods of time, even when the animal isn't thinking about it. So, unlike working memory or short-term memory, it also isn't limited in capacity. An animal's long-term memory, just like yours, can't get filled up. So one of the things that human research on long-term memory has shown us is that there isn't just a single long-term memory system. There's actually several long-term memory subsystems, and they're dissociable. And what that means is that basically, one can be affected while the other is left intact, right? So that's called a double dissociation, when you can affect one system leaving the other intact and the other way around. So one of the major distinctions in terms of subsystems of long-term memory is that between declarative and non-declarative memory. So beginning with non-declarative memory, that's memory that doesn't depend on awareness or explicit knowledge to be expressed. So non-declarative memory is memory that an animal can display or a human can display without consciously trying to remember the information being learned. So you may not even be aware of how the previous experience is affecting your behavior. And there's lots of examples of this from the case of human memory research. For example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with perceptual priming. This is when you see a stimulus at one point in time, and it facilitates processing that stimulus or a related stimulus at a later point in time. And another example of non-declarative memory is classical conditioning, which is when you learn an association at one point in time, and it can influence your performance at a later point in time. In particular, you can elicit a conditioned response to a stimulus, even if you're not remembering the conditioning event that took place earlier on. And finally, we have procedural memory, which is basically our knowledge of how to carry out various skills. And what we know is that performance obviously improves with practice. So if you think about riding a bike or playing a musical instrument, these are procedural skills, and the more you practice them, the better you get, even if you're not consciously trying to remember previous learning episodes. In contrast to non-declarative memory, or memory without the explicit goal of remembering, is declarative memory. And this is a knowledge-based system that involves conscious recollection and reflection on the information being retrieved. So here, the person or the animal is consciously trying to remember something. And this breaks down into two general kinds. One is semantic memory and the other is episodic memory. Your semantic memory is your basic knowledge, your basic memory for facts and knowledge about the world, such as the fact that Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, that Louisiana is one of the southern states, and so on. All right, so that's semantic memory, memory for facts. Episodic memory, in contrast, is memory for personally experienced events. And unlike semantic memory, right, semantic memory is general knowledge. Episodic memory is tagged with a particular time, place, and many other details of the situation, such as who was there, what took place, where it happened, when it happened, and why. Right? These are all the who, what, where, when, why. These are things that serve to define an episode, define a situation. And episodic memory is going to be discussed in the second part of this lecture. In this part, I'm going to be focusing on semantic memory. So one of the things that research into human semantic memory tells us is that information is always learned, it's always encountered in a particular context. Right? So when you're learning a list of words, for example, you're learning that list of words in a certain situation, in a particular room, at a particular point in time. Even if the goal of that isn't to learn those details of the context, right? Your goal in that case is to learn the list of words, but you learn it in a context. And what the research shows is that the contextual cues can become associated with the to be remembered information. Right? And as a result, because the context can become associated with the information, reinstating those cues, those contextual cues, can help trigger your memory for that information. So if you're learning a list of words, for example, in a particular room, trying to remember what the room was like, what the lighting was like, what the time of day was, it can help you retrieve that information. And one of the results of that is that remembering is better when it is done in the same context in which the information was originally learned. And when there's lots of evidence for this, including a classic study by Godden and Baddeley from '74, I call it the scuba diver experiment. In this one, scuba divers were asked to learn a list of words either on land or underwater, and they had to retrieve those words, they had to recall those words later on, either on land or on water. And what they manipulated was whether or not the retrieval context was the same as the learning context. And what they found was that memory was better when the retrieval context matched the learning context. So when they retrieved the words underwater, for example, when they had learned them underwater, performance would be better. So the question that I want to address is whether animal long-term memories work in the same way. So do the semantic memories of animals also contain clusters of associated cues, such that if you reinstate one, you can trigger the other associated memories. And I want to focus on a particular study here, and this is one by Reinhardt and colleagues from 2004. And they tested whether contextual cues can become associated with each other in the memory of a honeybee. So does presenting a cue trigger a full-blown detailed memory that affects the behavior of the bee? In other words, when bees encounter a food source, do they create a detailed representation of the food source, how it looked, how it smelled, and how they got there? So is all this integrated into a single memory? If it is, then reinstating one of those cues should trigger the other information. So in this study, they trained bees to feed on scented sugar water that was presented in an upside-down glass jar. Right, so the general idea is represented in this figure. The one on the left would be the glass jar that's used during training. The water is scented. It's sugar water, which the bees go crazy for. And it had a particular scent, right, infused into the water. During the test phase, the jar that was used was always empty and unscented. So two feeders, during the training task, two feeders were used. One 50 meters to the left of the hive, which was scented with rose, right, sugar water scented with rose. That's the one A below. And another one was 50 meters to the right, and it was scented with lemon. So the bees that visited the rose-scented feeder during the training were marked with a dot of a particular color. So they picked up the bees and put a little dot of paint on. And those that visited the lemon-scented feeder during training were marked with a different color. And the training took place over 3 days, and over 300 bees visited the site during that time. Now in the test phase, what they did was they replaced the scented feeders with empty scentless feeders so that the bees, and the reason why they removed the scent and the sugar water and cleaned it was so that the bees couldn't home in on a particular scent. Right? They wanted this to be a test of memory, not a test of perception. So the experimenters, so the setup is described in the figure below. You have the hive on the right. You have a tube that connects the hive to the device here that has a petri dish with a scent. And then they can blow in, with a fan, they can blow in air over this petri dish so that the scent gets transmitted to the hive. So what they did during the test phase was they blew in air for 8 minutes, and they looked to see how that affects the bees and where they go. Then rose scent for 8 minutes, and then they blew in air for another 8 minutes, followed by lemon scent for 8 minutes. And what they did was they recorded how likely the bees trained to the rose scented feeder were to visit the location where the rose feeder had been, right, as a function of whether their air is being blown in or rose scent is being blown into the hive. And they also recorded the likelihood that bees trained to feed on the lemon scented feeder were to visit the location where that feeder had been as a function of whether air was being blown in or lemon scent was being blown in. And this is what they found. On the left, we have the bees that were trained to the rose-scented feeder. And what we see is that when air is being blown in, very few bees actually leave the hive and go to the rose-scented feeder location. When the rose scent is blown in, many bees go and go towards that location. And we see a similar pattern when the lemon, for the bees trained with the lemon-scented feeder. When air is blown in, very few bees go towards the lemon-scented feeder, and that's very different when the lemon scent is blown in. So bees trained on the rose feeder were more likely to visit the left test feeder when the rose scent was blown into the hive compared to just air, and parallel findings when lemon scent was blown in for the bees trained on the lemon-scented feeder. And what this suggests is that the scents that were blown in were triggering a memory, a semantic memory of the food source and how to get there. Right? Not only that, but it also, by activating this memory, it also triggered a behavior. Right? It motivated them to leave the hive and go to that specific food location. So what this suggests is that these memories consist of a set of associated cues, right? Like where a food source is located, what it smells like, what kind of food is there, such that presenting one cue, like a scent, can activate other information, like the location of a food source. And again, all of this takes place in a brain that's about the size or smaller than a grain of sand. Okay, so in part 2, we will discuss episodic memory.